Fernandez, Executive Director of Tenaganita, which means Women's Force, an organization that works with women, migrants and refugees to protect and promote their rights at all times, as well as to create spaces so that they can achieve their full potential in society. And we are indeed very glad to be a partner with Human Resources Without Borders, whereby we can now together ensure the reduction in conditions of forced labor, as well as in the increased violations of rights of workers, particularly migrants. Being a Malaysian and as well as a daughter of a migrant worker who came to work in the plantations in Malaysia a long time ago, I look at Malaysia today as also as a country that is very, very highly dependent on migrant labor for its economic growth. We have about 4.6 million migrant workers, where 1 out of every 3 worker is a migrant laborer. Migrant workers are in almost every sector of employment in Malaysia, and that's why it is really very crucial to address the issue of migrant workers in order to ensure justice and rights for all workers in the country. Our experiences in Tenaganita reveal very hard and cold facts about forced labor situation. If we look at the policy framework whereby we have a situation where there is a law under the Passports Act that prohibits another person from holding the passport or the identity document of another person. But in reality, almost all employers in the country hold the passports of migrant workers with the argument that has been kind of accepted by the government that the migrant worker will run away, and therefore they need to keep the migrant worker in control and so hold the passports. It has even grown worse in certain situations where migrant workers who want to leave their workplace, and this is both in the plantation sector and manufacturing sector, where the migrant worker will have to deposit about $100 before the passport is given to him to go to town and come back. And I think this form of control is a contributory factor to forced labor situation, which needs not only control but confinement of the worker at the workplace. Now, if we look at another policy that also is a strong determinant to bring about forced labor, is the work permit system in the country. Now, Malaysia immigration gives the work permit with the condition that the worker is allowed to work only under the employer stated in the work permit. And if that employer is abusive during the contract term promised to the worker cannot leave the employer and go and work in another employer. That will be deemed to be going against the work permit system, and that the worker has become an undocumented worker in the process. And so the worker is forced to remain in that situation, forced to remain and work under the employer because otherwise his work permit will be cancelled and he will be forced to return home. Most of the time the workers do not want to do that because one, they have dependents back home whom they need to support and there is no alternative. Two, many workers are also in a debt situation where they have borrowed a lot of money and paid to the agent that has recruited them and ensured employment in Malaysia. Some of them have borrowed from money lenders. Some of them have both borrowed money and sold their land to come to get a job in the country. This brings about what I call a debt bondage situation, where they cannot make an alternative decision to go and work elsewhere because they have to make sure that they pay their debts. And it becomes worse because many of them also who are recruited by the same agents work under the same agent who are also outsourcing companies. And I think this is where the dynamics of recruitment and employment continues to control the worker. In terms of international standards and principles, we in Tenaganita state that an employer should be the one who should pay for the recruitment of the worker and not the worker, because the worker is poor. The worker cannot afford to pay, and that's why the worker is migrating to look for a job in Malaysia. The one who will gain a lot of profits and who has the capital is the employer, and therefore it's only principally correct that the employer bears the recruitment fees. It will also be important because then the manipulation of recruitment fees going higher and higher by the agency will also be controlled. And so my advice to employers is, as far as possible, to do direct recruitment. The government now says, like an example, in Bangladesh, they have stated a new policy that it will be a government-to-government recruitment. Now, this concept is also positive, but the government has to ensure that it has mechanisms at the various levels to ensure effective recruitment, and the destination country like Malaysia, where the government also puts in place proper data and information for employers to access and get their workers. And I think these are good practices to move forward to avoid the debt bondage situation. From the cases that we have handled, we find that employers want to absorb themselves from responsibility of managing the workers, of taking care of the workers, of being responsible for decent wages being paid. And so a significant number of employers today go through the outsourcing companies to get their workforce. During the last 3 years, Tenaganita has handled more than 3,600 cases of workers who have had their rights violated through outsourcing companies. And it has become very clear for us that the workers are put in a kind of a situation where the living conditions are horrendous. In a three-room house, we have had cases where the workers live in 40 to 50 workers would live in a three-room house, and thereby overcrowding. Now, not only that we have this large number of workers, but in cases where we have handled, where hypermarkets have been involved, the outsourcing companies deduct 35 ringgit per worker for water and electricity. And if you multiply that by 50 ringgit, it's an enormous profit the outsourcing company makes. Now, they also deduct for each worker for the rent, although they may be paying very low rent. And I think what has happened is that now if the workers resist, the company threatens them because they are holding their passports. And the workers are told, now if you question, I will call the police and I will arrest, and then you will get deported. So violence and fear of loss of job keeps the workers in a kind of controlled situation, and this in itself is forced labor. And so when companies, hypermarkets like Carrefour rely on outsourcing companies for their labor force, they must be clear on how the workers are being treated each day by the outsourcing company. Is there a monitoring mechanism in place? Do you have a way whereby the workers give you feedback of their treatment? And actually, my advice is do away with outsourcing companies, because you have new problems coming into your way with this form of employment. It is better to have direct employment where you can ensure your accountability is set in place through policies and through mechanisms that you can create, so that forced labor is eliminated from being practiced by your company. And I think this is very, very fundamental, and therefore the more a company wants to run away from its responsibilities, the greater your risk of putting the workers in a forced labor situation. I'll take a short break. It is very important for employers, when they want to make the difference and the change, to be innovative and to find ways of how they can best communicate with the workers, so that the message that is given to the workers on their rights is understood by all. Particularly when you have a country where 12 different nationalities of workers are being recruited for employment in Malaysia. One innovative way that HR Without Borders is really doing is to, through art, begin to create the message of workers' rights. And so employers have this opportunity now. Instead of having a lot of words, instead of writing out their contract purely in English without the workers understanding, you can now communicate with the workers effectively through art, through pictures, through posters at the workplace, where everyone who sees the poster will understand the right, the message of labor rights being communicated. And we must recognize that when workers see that their employer is recognizing their rights and is ensuring that the rights are respected and upheld, the workers will indeed become more productive, and as well as you will have a stable workforce. Messages effectively to the workers is fundamental to a process for change. In my experience working with factories, would reveal that this process of getting feedback and communicating with workers must be an ongoing process, and therefore it is very important to ensure mechanisms on how workers can continuously provide you feedback for change. For example, in one of the factories that Tenaganita had this program, the management was very, very surprised to see that sexual harassment was a key factor that affected a number of the women migrant workers in the company. Now, through a consultation process, once this issue came out, then the company put in place policies and grievance procedure mechanisms to address the issue. Now, that is very, very important element for the companies to ensure that there can be a continuous process of change. But for the workers as well, to have that continuous process of empowerment in the factories is also equally important, that we have a process for leadership development among the workers, so that through these leaders, the management can effectively communicate and get feedback where both management, the company, and the workers will benefit.